do want to welcome you to ACE in the Hole, the fourth and final convening of a series of conversations that Independent Sector has sponsored over the course of the last 2 months or so to talk about the intent, the direction, the probability of the Accelerating Charitable Efforts, or ACE Act. And this is the final conversation where we actually begin to pull together some of the various threads and learnings that we have had over the course of the past 3 conversations. I'm Jeff Moore, the Chief Strategy Officer here at Independent Sector, and I'm really pleased to have all of you here with us and to have 3 either current members or recent alums of the IS Public Policy Committee joining us today as speakers. Before I start, I do want to respectfully acknowledge that Independent Sector is based in Washington, D.C., the ancestral home of the Nacotchtank Anacostan people and the Piscataway people who are still in the area and working to reclaim their land and their traditional practices. I also want to acknowledge that many of the buildings that we inhabit here in Washington, D.C. were built with the labor of enslaved people. As we begin, I also ask that we take a moment of silence to remember the more than 770,000 people in the United States who have lost their lives to COVID, and the countless others around the globe who have fallen to this virus. Please join me for just a moment of silence. Thank you for honoring their memories. So again, welcome to the 4th and final webinar in our series on the ACE Act and philanthropy reform. Before we dive in, let me start with a few technical logistical notes. Closed captioning has been enabled during today's webinar, and at any point, please know that you are free to share your thoughts or submit questions by way of the chat function on Zoom. I'd also ask, please, that you do remember to keep your microphones on mute. Finally, I do want to let participants know that this event, is being recorded and will shortly be posted to the IS website. So now that we have dealt with some of the logistics, I'd like to ask our panelists to come on camera and for each of them to introduce themselves. And Cindy, I'm going to start with you. And you're on mute, Cindy.
Thanks so much to Independent Sector and to Jeff and Allison and all others in the policy committee that have been working so hard to really become educated on these issues. I'm Cindy Lott. I'm with Columbia University, and I'm happily a member of the policy committee and one of their former policy fellows. I'm an associate professor of practice, and I run the nonprofit management program and do research in charitable policy.
Thank you, Cindy. Matthew.
Thank you, Jeff, and a big thank you to the Independent Sector team. My name is Matthew L. Evans, Director of Public Policy for United Philanthropy Forum. Glad to be here.
Thanks, Matthew. We're glad to have you as well. And Jan.
Hi, yes, thank you. I'm Jan Masaoka. I'm the CEO of the California Association of Nonprofits. We say Cal Nonprofits for short.
Thank you, Jan. So before I turn this over to Cindy, I want to just give a few words of backdrop or context. Again, remembering that this is a conversation that is starting to knit together what we have heard over the course of the past 3. So let me do a little bit of orienting and scene setting. As we all know, the Accelerating Charitable Efforts Act, or the ACE Act, focuses on private foundations and the regulation of donor-advised funds, or DAFs, a charitable giving vehicle. Links to the IS summary of the ACE Act and a recent blog summarizing our first 3 convenings will be shared in the chat box if you have any interest in digging deeper. One of the most common questions that we have gotten in each of these convenings is actually, what is the status of this piece of legislation? And currently what we can tell you, what we know, is that the bill originally introduced in the Senate, of course, has been referred to the Senate Finance Committee. And there is some conversation about companion legislation coming out of the House, though we have not yet seen that bill introduced. Our first three convenings were framed through lenses that independent sector is using to discuss the ACE Act and charitable reform, philanthropy reform specifically. And those three lenses are trust, equity, and resources. Today, we'll briefly review the highlights from those convenings as they relate to the ACE Act, consider the trade-offs the information presents, and dive into how you and your respective organizations can locate more resources, evaluate information, and come to your own conclusions about the direction, the intent of these reforms, and this specific piece of legislation. Our first slide, trust. Let me just offer a little bit of background. So earlier this year, Independent Sector's Trust in Civil Society report indicated that public trust in philanthropy is declining. So panelists in our first webinar discussed whether current philanthropic practices live up to policymakers and the public's expectations of them to be trustworthy institutions. Panelists were split on the ACE Act's ability to increase trust in philanthropy. On one side, the ACE Act's impact on a few practices may not be enough to turn the tide of public trust in philanthropy. On the other hand, some argued that the bill addresses some issues in philanthropic practice that many see as not being in the public interest, not serving the public interest, and therefore increased transparency through a vehicle like the ACE Act could in fact increase public trust. If we can go to the second slide, Chris. Panelists in our second convening examined the ACE Act from a perspective of equity and emphasized that the lack of data on DAFs makes it very challenging to evaluate the ACE Act through an equity lens. The available data suggests that there is no indication that the ACE Act will accelerate giving into marginalized communities. However, it was also noted in the course of this convening that a 2021 report shows more high-income donors giving to communities of color and social justice issues. Where that leads us, what we learn from those data is really yet to be determined. Panelists agreed that reforms are needed beyond the ACE Act, which of course is really about working within the current system. The ACE Act is about the current system, but that reforms beyond the ACE Act are likely needed to significantly accelerate equitable funding in the sector. It was suggested that philanthropy reform policies, including proposals to regulate donor-advised funds, may impact what one panelist referred to as the charitable racial wealth gap. Chris, if we can go to the third and final slide. Our most recent convening, held really just, I think, 2 weeks ago, looked at money flowing into philanthropy and specifically how the ACE Act might impact donor behavior and the total amount of dollars available for grant making. Panelists were once again split on how the ACE Act would impact giving. On one side, research supports the ideas that deadlines can encourage donors and foundations alike to make and follow through with plans to allocate money to charities, a forcing function, if you will. On the other hand, research also indicates that some provisions could make it more challenging for donors to give. Fundraisers specifically also expressed concern that donors might view reforms as a penalty, resulting in donors choosing to spend their money elsewhere. There was one thing on which everyone was agreed. These are hard conversations, and conversations that the sector simply has to have. We have talked about this in the policy committee many times over. The issue of donor advised funds, reform of donor advised funds, has been bubbling under the surface in our sector for about 20 years, maybe a bit more. And we absolutely have to get to the other side of this conversation. It continues to suck energy out of the system when there is so much else that we need to do. Now, whether or not the ACE Act becomes law, we have an opportunity as a sector to engage in those hard conversations into the future. And providing a space for those conversations is a key role for independent sector going forward. For a more in-depth recap of our past 3 convenings, please do follow the link to the summary blog post that I believe has been put in the chat. So with that, I'd like to turn over to Cindy Lott to initiate a discussion among our panelists around how we make more sense of what we have heard to date and how we further ground this particular piece of legislation and its intent in the broader historical debate around improving philanthropy. Cindy, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thanks to everybody who's here. It's a great space for independent sector to be working in, and that is through educational platform here to air lots of different views and bring in a lot of different information. So good on everybody who is trying to do more education and also educate our own organizations that we're within. So thank you for that. I'm so pleased to have both Jan and Matthew with us. Independent sector hasn't taken a position on this. Matthew's organization has not, Jan's has. So we are going to go through a number of things in the 45 minutes that we have here, a number of different questions that aren't specific to the legislation itself, but really about what the debate over this legislation actually can mean for our sector. And the fact that the process has been what it has been is also important to this sector. DAFs, as Jeff mentioned, this is a long-standing issue. There's nothing new about DAFs for all of us that have been in this space for some time. But what is new are the new players that are in it and how it has created some schisms. It also has raised up some pretty philosophical issues at times and principles in tension. And that is worth thinking about, not just for this legislation, but for all sorts of policy that we would like to be engaged in. I'm going to start by asking questions, and then we'll get into some conversation. And then towards the end, we will make sure that we have some time for questions from the audience and some takeaways before we leave. So with that, I want to talk right off the bat about why this has been so difficult. There are definitely principles in tension here. As was mentioned, big piece of this, as you've heard, is around the time lag. When you've got time and money all involved in the same piece of legislation, you know that you're going to have some real principles there that are definitely having to be balanced. The other big tension that I know we're seeing is around how much we want to allow donors to do, obviously, to make sure that we've got their intent, but also that we want to look at the beneficiaries and the beneficiary communities and make sure that that's what our priorities are as we're giving tax breaks for this money. So with that, I want to ask, I'm going to turn it over to Jan first. Again, Cal Nonprofits has taken a stance on this. And I'm wondering, Jan, if you can talk about how you see the principles in tension and how you all decided to prioritize them.
Sure. So just to let you know, last month, our board of directors took a position to support the ACE Act. We have been working on state-based legislation around donor advised funds for the last 4 years, so it's not a new issue to us. And I have to say, we don't think it's a perfect bill, but I'll tell you, if we limited our support to perfect bills, we would never support anything about anything ever. I also just want to say off the top that both the framing that Jeff brought up from IS and your framing around tensions don't feel comfortable to us as framings. I think they're just that whole premise. I can't stay within that because I just don't think that that's the right framing. I do want to say that this is one of the most important, most visible, and most emotional issue for our members. This is one of the reasons why it's so important to us. And this discussion here has felt very technical and a little bit on the policy wonk side. And I just want to give one story about it to get on a slightly different perspective. So we have one of our members is an African-American woman who found out the hard way many years ago that when you get out of prison, you can't get your children back if you don't have a permanent address. So she decided she would create a shelter so that women could have a permanent address, get their children back, because it's really hard to start rebuilding your life if you can't have your children back with you. Over the last 20 years, she has scraped and struggled and has gotten the stuff together. So now that she does have the shelter for many women with their children who are able to stay there immediately after coming out of prison. Within 50 miles of her, there is a community foundation with over $1 billion in donor advised funds that won't have a meeting with her because they say you have to build relationships with our donors, not with us. And within 100 miles of hers, there's a commercial fund that has many, many billions in donor advised funds that is really just like a bank. It's like asking Wells Fargo, help us meet your checking account holders. So I'm not saying that if the ASAC's passed, it might not necessarily affect her, but I just want to give people a feeling for why this is so emotional for people to be feeling like that they're standing at the gates of wealth and unable to get any access. But let me just speak to one of the issues that both of you have brought up, and that's the issue of equity. And we don't think that the equity argument centers around where DAF fund holders distribute their money, okay? That in fact, if we think it's about the equity issue is about cost to the public and benefit to the public, and it's about fairness. So it's on the other side of the DAF transaction, okay? It's on the giving side, not on the distribution of funds. If a person opens a DAF account today with $10 million, they get a tax deduction for 2021 of $10 million, okay? This cost, and we know this from research, this costs the government $7 million in taxes overall, okay? So it's not that the government just doesn't have any effect. The government loses $7 million in taxes, state and local and federal governments, because of that $10 million donation. The benefit to the donor is not equally distributed. The benefit to the donor goes only to the top 10% of our society. So we need to stop talking about donors and we need to start talking about the top 10% of donors. That's who we're talking about, not donors in general. But the cost to the public is immediate, that $7 million in government funding, but the benefit to the public, meaning distribution to active working nonprofits, will come from a donor advised fund from a private foundation, $500,000 this year, but they get to count their own salaries, rents, and payments to family members as part of that 5%. And if it's been put into a donor advised fund, it could be sometime next week or it could be sometime in infinity. So we believe that something a little closer than infinity, given the $7 million cost to the government this week, is something that should be just a little bit closer. And we also feel that we do not want to restrict the meaning of equity to meaning donations to nonprofits that serve communities of color and other marginalized communities, because we believe that it's also important for the arts, for environmental, for science, for scientific research, for education, and even things we either don't agree with or think are trivial. We think that the point is public good needs to be matched at the same time as public cost, and that public cost is to the whole public and the benefit is to only 10% of people. So I think that that's a different way to think about equity, and that's where we're coming from.
I appreciate the reframing and the fact that you're really thinking about it on the donor side as well as on the beneficiary side. Appreciate that. Matthew, your own response?
Yeah, no, I think Jan makes a lot of really important points. And for us, at the forum, at United Philanthropy Forum, we try to center our public policy work with a racial equity lens. And so I think some of the tensions that you mentioned earlier, while maybe the legislation might be well intended, I think some of the steps the people who drafted this legislation or worked with members of Congress, some of the steps that they took led to some tension or just some confusion in the sector. I mean, if you look at an article from earlier this year that talked about the introduction of this bill, it said that, you know, some folks got together in a Manhattan conference room to discuss this legislation, and then it made its way to Congress to be introduced. We think there are it's a lot to cover. It's a nuanced conversation. There are many layers. Equity being, for us, a chief issue for us. So we wanted to make sure that we are talking to a broad swath of folks, not only inside the sector, but also externally, including our nonprofit partners, to ensure equitable outcomes. And you know, so when we talk about some of the anecdotes that Jan just gave, it's important that we see some equitable outcomes. But however, when I'm talking to a member, for example, Senator King's staff, you know, how can we ensure that these equitable outcomes happen? The answer I got was they just have to. And so we just have to be really careful to understand what this all means. And so I think there's a mixed bag of agreement between both philanthropy and nonprofits, and for a good reason, because it's a complicated issue. And I don't think at the top of this being rolled out, the authors, as well as the proponents who initiated this work, did their due diligence when working with the larger nonprofit community, as well as the philanthropic sector. And so we find ourselves here trying to dig through the mud to figure out the best way forward. You're on mute.
Feels a bit like the sector is having to kind of reverse engineer at this point to figure out where to enter into the conversation that's already been started. So in terms of larger lessons that we could be learning from this, to extrapolate on this, mostly because there are a lot of people thinking this may not go anywhere this time around, but it's going to be back. And certainly other much larger philanthropic reform is going to be on the table at some point. What types of broader lessons can we take from this in terms of the process that you wish that you would have seen and that we could improve upon here? Jan?
You're going out of order on the question, Cindy, so I guess, you know.
Well, it's because we have a bit less time.
No, I'm happy with that. I'm glad. Like, so I want to say so thanks. So first of all, I also have to say that if we limited ourselves to supporting bills that had been inclusively created, we would never support anything. That's just not how policy works. I do think there's some special characteristics here that are difficult. One is nonprofits don't really feel that they can speak freely in front of foundations or to be known to have done so. We held some meetings brought nonprofits to meetings with California legislators on the subject, for example. And I remember one where one development director was at the meeting and he said, I'm only here because my executive director needs to have plausible deniability that we're supporting this particular bill, okay? Because they're so afraid of the community foundation. And I would say of disapproval, and we've seen community foundations here actively opposing our donor advice fund via work and encouraging and implying to many of their grantees that they should as well. The other thing is that privately, I've met privately with many community foundation presidents, and almost all of them have said privately that they personally would be okay with 5 to 8% payout requirement, but that's not something that they can say publicly. So we also see that they can say that maybe in a group of community foundations, but they don't feel comfortable engaging nonprofits with that kind of discussion. And then finally, just as nonprofits are so timid, maybe overly timid, but maybe understandably timid about speaking in front of foundations, community foundations and commercials are just as timid when they're talking to billionaires. You know, I've been in a room with community foundations and billionaires, and I was thinking, why is everybody acting so weird here? And then I thought, oh my gosh, they're acting just like us with them. And I think that these are things that are beyond just making a phone call or something like that. We have different points of view, and we're not used to that. We're not used to discussing different points of view, and most of the time nonprofits don't feel that we can. So that's why one of the things our board feels very strongly about is that we need to speak out because we can, when a lot of the other nonprofits just don't feel that they can.
A follow-up question for you, or if Matthew wants to go ahead and weigh in on this too. So is there a space, now that we're really seeing how divisive some of these issues can be, which might be good in the short run that we're having the conversations, but it also could be harmful at times that we're divided on some legislation that's very directed towards the sector. Is there a space here for having intermediaries, for essentially having the brokers, if you will, to help with some of the power differentials and the fact that there's less than transparent communication at times than we'd like? I see you shaking your head, John.
You know, I think that, you know, the public policy arena has very well worn paths for how to work things out. And they're not, you'd never expect a whole industry to get together and agree on something. You know, I think it's like we in the last few days, we've had meetings with community foundations and with foundation associations here in California. Met last week with somebody from Schwab Charitable. Okay, so we are reaching out and having those conversations. I think, frankly, that given the skittishness that is felt by lots of people, that I think a lot of times these things work better in one-to-ones than in a mediated public conversation.
Okay, Matthew?
Well, I would say, I mean, I agree to that point, but I also, you know, this bill impacts a large group of, it impacts the entire sector. It impacts nonprofit, it impacts philanthropy. And so while we won't have a perfect bill and while we can't agree on everything, I think there needs to be some due diligence done. There needs to be conversations had. You know, we talk about at the forum, just the collectiveness on issues. And so what we're trying to make sure and ensure is that we don't, you know, this is a window in time, and we're talking about equity a lot. We don't want to put forth something that is flawed in nature and then find out years later we still have more work to do. And so we're not saying that we're not saying it's going to be perfect, but we also want to make sure we take the time, and we do have time here. I think there is intention. From a lot of our members, there is a lot of goodwill, and I think a lot of folks agree that reform needs to happen. What that looks like, there are some provisions within the legislation that many folks agree with, and that's why we want to just make sure we take our time. We're talking to folks like Jan, we're talking to others, organizations, our nonprofit partners, but also there's a sort of an internal education piece as well as an external education piece. And so I just want to make sure that we're cautious enough where we get this right, so that we know that we did the right thing down the road.
Well, that'll be, Jan, I'll turn this to you in just a moment. Jan's mentioned this already about if waiting or the perfect being the enemy of the good in some ways. Incrementalism is also a worn path for policymaking. I think what is unusual in some ways about this is that usually our sector gets the policy adjacent from another sector. And this time around, it's actually directed at us, and that's different. And I would suggest that if we don't learn some lessons from this, we've really squandered an opportunity. Jan?
That's a great point, Cindy. I appreciate that. And I want to say that to us, a lot of times, and I know I'm oversimplifying here, but you know, we have 50 minutes. Is that, you know, like one of the things we see in affordable housing is we see everybody saying we support affordable housing. Okay, it's just the details. Oh, but not that affordable housing bill, not that one, not that one, not that site, not that site, no, not that site either. That's how we're experiencing our discussions with both with philanthropy and with the commercials. Okay, so then you have to find yourself saying, well, wait a minute, if we're supposedly all on the same side, then tell us one site that you might be willing to let us build affordable housing on. And they say back, still working on that. I just want to say that we really feel that that's how we're experiencing it. Maybe that's not how people are intending it to be felt, but that's kind of how it feels.
Matthew, comment?
Progress is a slow process. And so, I mean, we know, you know, there are people who've been in this fight much longer than I have. And, you know, I think, yes, we don't want to be in the way of progress. And I think a lot of us, because we see this, like I said, this window of time as an opportunity to impact systems change, we just want to get it right. So I think there has been a history in philanthropy, of course, of people saying, no, and that is not our position. I think you've seen other groups come out and say no, blanket, as soon as the bill is introduced. That is not what the forum is doing. We welcome the dialogue so that we can get something right. If it's not this year, next year, within the near term. I think a lot of the folks that we work with, a lot of our members and their members are well intentioned into getting something right within the near term and not kicking the can down the road. So I definitely am a proponent, and I think our organization is a proponent of having something done soon.
Well, and to me, this is one of the broader lessons that we could take from this. I mean, this DAFs conversation has been a conversation for a long time, but it's actually been a challenge for some time too. This is what I would call, predictable policy. We knew this was coming. And the fact that we're still really trying to figure out some of this, I think should be something we think hard about in our sector. And I know a lot of good people are working on that, and not because we're going to coalesce all the time, for sure, but we would hate to be caught flat-footed in the fact that we have legislation that was not necessarily including all of us, or even some of us, to discuss some of this. I think is really emblematic of some of the issues we need to resolve for the next rounds. As you say, it's a long haul, and we have time until you don't, right? Until legislation is suddenly there. I want to ask, so many people have noted that you don't think that this particular piece is going to go anywhere. It's in Senate Finance right now. There may be something in the House, as Jeff mentioned, soon. I can think about this, but I want to make sure I give a chance to you all. Why does it matter what it is we're doing right now if it's not going to be this particular bill? What would you like to see happen out of this conversation for the next round? Matthew?
So I think that's a great question. We believe that the reforms that a lot of our members are envisioning go beyond this piece of legislation. And so what we tried to do at the forum is work with our working group and other members to think about what reform looks like, not just in the context of this legislation, but broader reform, not just in the context of mandates by the government, but also other regulations. And we're looking at transparency, we're looking at accountability, we're also looking at equity and what that means. And I appreciate Jan's definition of equity earlier. And there are folks that have different definitions of equity. And so there won't be a perfect way to put all that together. But for us, we believe this is an opportunity to really come up with some substantial reform pieces that can be handled through legislation, but also through other ways. Again, I think this is our mission in this time, in this window that we have. And so, we want to provide an opportunity to analyze what this legislation means, but also what other proposals may mean through a racial equity lens. We want to make sure we provide an opportunity for our members and other sector leaders and our nonprofit partners to come together and think about the current hurdles and challenges that are there. And we want to develop recommendations that we can sit out into the field and pick people's brains to see what we can take to the next iteration. Like you said, we don't think this legislation is going to go anywhere. It hasn't all year. And so this is an opportunity, but we do recognize from philanthropy's past mistakes in public policy that we must be proactive and not always being reactive to things. And we must be also ask our questions of ourselves. Do we want to be the gatekeepers of the status quo, or do we want to be change makers? And I think this is an opportunity to be those change makers. And the gatekeepers, I think we just have to leave them behind.
Jan?
I kind of lost track of the question.
The original question, although Matthew's thrown out a whole bunch of interesting issues there, is around even if this legislation is going nowhere, what is it that you really need out of the conversations that are happening right now? And I love the fact, because that I work a lot with state regulators, I love the fact that you guys have really been working at the two different levels, right? Jurisdictional levels. So that may be part of this, but what do you need out of this right now for the next iteration if this one doesn't go anywhere?
Well, I think the big picture is there's a lot of backlash against excessive wealth and against how that excessive wealth is sometimes used through philanthropic and nonprofit legal entities to do things that really aren't public good. And so I think that's one of the big contexts that I think hasn't really been talked about, that sense of that overall feeling about that. I think that another issue that at least not in this particular IS forum, is one that's been two other issues. I think one are that we feel like need to be addressed in some way, not maybe not as a package, but one is the incredible growth of the donor advised fund sponsor and industry, including a lot that combine a lot of different vehicles in ways that are especially attractive and especially facilitate wrongdoing. That doesn't mean they always do, but they certainly are well positioned to facilitate that if they wanted to, if a donor wanted to do that. And also, I think that's so much clearer now how much private foundation money is going to donor advised funds. Over $1 billion in the last 3 years, it's been reported, all of which can count towards payout. Although for all practical purposes, they still maintain control of the assets and it still hasn't gone to active nonprofits. So those are things that really concern us. But I think that we're trying to tackle not just a narrow technical piece about any of these different points, but these big issues, tax equity and who gets tax benefits, and is there a match between the cost to the public and a cost and the benefit to the public? And can we, in many different channels, right, find ways to ensure that we make it at least a little harder for bad guys to use nonprofit and philanthropic vehicles. And I think, one important thing here is that, we hear a lot, oh, hardly anybody does that. And I feel like hardly anybody drives drunk either. But that's not an argument against laws against drug driving. That's an argument for it. Okay, so the fact is, we're not talking about clamping down on zillions of people, right? So I think the thing is, the fact that that means, so there are people that drive drunk, and we need to have laws against them, and we need to have blood alcohol limits, and we need to have all those things. That doesn't mean that we're against drinking or that we're against driving. We think that donor advised funds are a good vehicle, an important vehicle, as are fiscal sponsorships, as are private foundations, as are active nonprofits. And then lastly, I would just say something that our former board member, Sarah Pillsbury, used to say pretty often, which always affected me. And that was, if we're working on something that we think that we can accomplish in our lifetimes, then we're thinking too small.
I like it. I would say, a couple of different reactions on this. So long ago, I remember being at an IS meeting where somebody asked, so, hey, so do you think, DAFs eventually will get regulated in some way more than they are now? This was probably 8 or 9 years ago. And I said, well, of course they will eventually, because if there's enough money in the system, you'd have to, and when commercial players get involved, you'd have to, and because eventually with enough money, you will have some fraudsters enter, even if it's a small portion, it will be problematic. What we're seeing now, and interestingly, when I go to conversations, I hear a lot about the tax issues, et cetera, but at the state level, it's much more about some of the transparency issues that you raised here, Jan. It's about who is giving to what vehicle and who knows about it, and does it count in terms of what their legal requirements are, et cetera. So we do have a couple of different observations of what is happening within DAFs. And it will be interesting to see if any legislation really deals with all of that, or whether we will have states kind of doing it on their own. Meanwhile, this federal legislation being discussed. I want to move now. So thank you for that. I want to move to next steps here, getting a little more tactical for organizations, those that have either made a decision or those that have not. I'm going to start with you, Matthew, because you all have not, in fact, made a decision or taken a position yet. What is it that you will be looking to learn? What would help turn the tide for you? And how much time do you think that will take?
Well, I think one is, I mentioned earlier that we do have a working group on this issue. I think some of the things that we wanted to learn initially were, what were folks' opinion of this piece of legislation itself. But I think as we got deeper into our conversations, we also learned some new things. We learned that folks, the way people view this legislation or view reform is bigger than this piece of legislation. And so we have taken about, I think, About, I think we're in our 6, maybe 7 months of our working group. We're working on our final recommendations. I think our recommendations will be done by the end of the year. The time for us to go to our broader organization as well as the broader sector, I think kicks off in Q1 of next year. But I think ultimately we want to know, we want to learn how any type of reform will equal equitable outcomes to communities across the country. And that's our biggest concern. And we need our partners in the nonprofit sector to work with us and vice versa, to really have a substantive conversation about what that means. So for us, that is top of mind, is the equity issue, and will remain the biggest issue for us.
Jan, knowing that you all have already taken a position, do you feel like the next iteration of your work is around coalition building or educating others, or what's your role at this point?
It's actually rare for us to take a position on national affairs. We feel like there's enough to do in California, to tell you the truth. Plus, people on the East Coast expect us to get up too early in the morning, for meetings. I think that we are working with members of our state legislature on possible legislation for California this coming year. So that's what we're working on right now. I think transparency is a way of, because the public has a stake in this, right? We're losing tax money to the top 10% of society, and public has a stake in knowing what happens. That's why we have 990s. That's why nonprofits have to report. And I think that, so that's why we're in favor of transparency. It helps, it helps keep the good guys good, knowing that's available to the public.
I want to revisit or maybe explore just a little bit more in terms of what types of research. And I see there's a note even in the chat about this. I mentioned to Matthew and to Jan before we joined today that I was just at Arnova, and they had a special series actually on DAFs research. They divided it up into 3 different sessions with multiple experts talking about it. Some of it was empirical research. Some of it was very much based on economic research. And I'm curious, and I welcome any members or any attendees here to drop in the chat as well. What is it that you wish that you had either from the academic community that could churn some of this for you, or if there were other resources that could answer questions that you really would like to know because they have good analytical models, or because they can do vast amounts of data research quickly through certain means these days, surveys and others?
I think that all the things we've wanted to know, we've already put in previous editions of legislation. We want to know about whether the degree to which donor advised funds are being populated from private foundations as public as part of their payout. We want to know about DAF to DAF transfers, or money kind of circulates, counting again as payout. But it can circulate, indefinitely. And we want to have ways so that to provide the information to the state attorney general to be able to see, to investigate wrongdoing. So a lot of what we have asked for are things that the transparency is partly, some of it for public consumption, but also to make it available to law enforcement. Just like police officers need to know about people's background as they pull over a drunk driver, we think that information is important. Some information is important to law enforcement.
Okay. Matthew, I know you addressed a little bit of this before, but anything else specifically, big picture or more granular, that you wish you all knew to help?
I think for data wise, I think definitely need to evaluate, benefits and burdens of the legislation for stakeholders. I think there's the timing mismatch piece here, short-term versus long-term investments. I think all of that is data that we need to really help us address some of these reforms. To Jan's point, there is a lot of data out there, but as it's specific to this piece of legislation from an equity standpoint, I think there's a few other things that we would like to see, including what the benefit piece would be and versus the burden of the legislation for all stakeholders involved.
But if I were to say one thing we want to know, how much of DAF money actually, and private foundation money actually goes to active nonprofits. And if it's really high percentages, awesome, okay? And we mean fund by fund, not an aggregate, so that one person can't move 10 million and other people can move 0. But if it really is high, then great. Then if most people aren't driving drunk, that's not a reason for not passing drunk driving legislation.
I hear you. You heard it here first, the comparison of DAFs and DUIs. But it's not new to me, that comparison, because I work with regulators and enforcement community a lot. So, all right, it's time to go to the audience. I see a few comments here in the sidebar here in the chat, but I have not seen questions. Don't make me call on you, as I always tell people, because I'll do that. I'm used to it in class. Let's see. Audience questions. I'm waiting. All right, if you were trying to, I'm gonna pose another question. Jan, especially because you wanted to reframe, as we were talking initially about some of the tensions. Jan, if you were trying to convince someone, one of the organizations on this call, to take a position, and hopefully I would think in the way that you would want them to align with you, what is your single best argument for that?
Philanthropic reform is in our neck of the woods. We're fighting for fairness and for the well-being of communities in many, many different neighborhoods. This happens to be one that's in our neighborhood, and we can't ignore it. So think about fairness, how do we bring fairness to the issue of tax deductions and benefits to active nonprofits?
Cindy?
Yeah.
Is it by keeping things the same?
Cindy, isn't this legislation really targeted at commercial donor advised funds? With the exception for community foundations that's built into the legislation, and probably the thought that that exception applies to the vast majority of other single mission donor advised funds as well. Isn't this really targeted at commercials? And if that's the case, shouldn't we call a spade a spade?
Well, it is, I don't know if people would use the word targeted, but it definitely is supposed to address, shall we say, the larger amounts and the volume of money going through. There is the specific carve out around community foundations, but I do think it's at our peril as a sector that we think other people and policymakers and the public parse like we do legislation when they see something about DAFs, or we as consumers, you see this all the time from your bank or from your investment company talking about DAFs and what a great tax deduction vehicle they are. I doubt that most people will think about those distinctions, but correct that the legislation at least does make some distinction there. Let's see, Lucy Salcido Carter has a question for Matthew. Will philanthropic reform recommendations you're working on coming out later this month provide direction for specific detailed state and federal legislation? Will they get into the weeds, your recommendations?
Yeah, so I'd say yes and no. So as far as legislation, there will be some legislative recommendations. There are also some sort of self-regulation recommendations for the sector as well. So it's a little bit of both, a mix of the best of both worlds, in our opinion. Because I do think from our members and talking to some partners, every recommendation or resolution in a lot of folks' mind doesn't have to end up in proposed legislation per se.
Well, it's a fraught relationship sometimes between Congress and our sector self-regulating. That's been a very long and fraught conversation, and one that I doubt will go away. Let's see. Any other questions here from the audience?
This is Paul Shervish.
Hi, Paul.
Hi. I've been in this for about 40 years. And one of the tensions that is in this legislation, and I hear it today from all the speakers, is the first thing is everybody's trying to do the right thing. And what the right thing is differs for different people. But I just want to point out two tensions that have been around for 40 years, and let people comment on if they will or go on to another question. The first one is between the wealthy giving too much and the wealthy not giving enough. If we read simply the Chronicle of Philanthropy and reports that come out, or look at Bridgespan and their reports, we're back to the perennial question of what I just mentioned. Are the wealthy dominating, or are they not giving enough? That's one tension that, and giving in the right ways, and of course needing legislation, which brings me to my second point. The second tension is between inspiration and legislation. Inspiration being, what are the ways that we can mobilize more charitable giving, period, to the active charities. We can't forget that almost every one of our organizations would love to have an endowment and would love to have a larger endowment. And endowments are precisely a way in which organizations, charitable organizations, accumulate resources to persist over a long period of time. I think DAFs have that as one of their main functions. For many years, my wife and I did not contribute from our DAF. And then we were able to make larger donations. Our amount grew. So whatever research we do that looks at the individual funds and not the organizational giving, that 20 to 30%, but looks at individual funds, we should look at them over a period of time, not just for 1 year, because DAFs really can provide a way to accumulate wealth in a purposeful manner to eventually give to charities in a more consequential way. So the two tensions, inspiration and legislation. And second, the wealthy are giving too much, the wealthy are not giving enough. And those two overlap.
Comments from Jan or Matthew? Response?
We're okay with, we're not, don't want to make an argument about whether money today is better given away others. I mean, I've heard this,
Yeah.
later, I would say that if you want to give it away later, that's great. Just get the tax deduction later.
But then we can't accumulate that with our regular annual amounts of money that we have to put
I
away.
think that one difference I do think that has struck me recently is that when a large sum of money goes to a community foundation or to a commercial vehicle or to one of the many other kinds of donor advised funds, that those DAF sponsors believe that it has now been given to the community. And I think to nonprofits, we tend to think that money is now sitting in a DAF sponsor's checking account, savings account, and it hasn't been given to community. So I do think that that's a difference in how we view, is it a community asset when it sits there not doing anything, or is it not?
See, I look at endowments as fitting exactly your description.
Yeah, take the tax deduction later. That's all we think. Yeah.
You would say that for endowments as well, like when you give to a charity for an endowment?
Oh,
Because that money is not being given immediately. The majority of it is given in the future. And so how do you want to have those tax deductions be
we're
for
not
the
against
future?
tax deductions for donations or for endowments. We think that this gap, though, needs to be narrowed. For endowments to be spending money, for example, on salaries, rent, payments to family members and other people, we don't think that that should count towards their required payouts.
No, I'm talking not for foundations. I'm talking about for the charities themselves.
I'm sorry, I don't understand. Endowments at the charities? Right.
Yeah, endowments at charities aren't being spent at the present.
I wish we had an endowment that I could use a payout to pay my parents. That would be awesome, but we
Yeah, but what I'm saying is
But I know what I'm saying.
parallel.
I think that we need to curb what counts as payout. And I think that this DAF to DAF, private foundation to DAF, these payments to inappropriate uses, I think that those are the areas where we do need to address those.
So this leads us back to, I'm going to round up here since we're almost to the hour, leads back to the time and money existential question here. And that's where we're also seeing a lot of the data and the research. Allison has dropped into a chat one of the newest and really most interesting pieces of research that's out there that may at least address some of this for models. I want to ask, thank you for that discussion. I want to ask for the very last takeaways, and also for anyone that would like to drop into the chat what they wish that IS might be able to supply or help you out with as a platform. They are here to help educate and help all of you make the decisions that you need to make. So you can drop that into the chat. Matthew, let you go first, and then Jan have the last word before we wrap up. Takeaways.
Sure. Thank you, Cindy, and thank you again, Independent Sector, for putting this on it, and thank you, Jan, for joining me in this conversation. I think one of the biggest takeaways here is that there's still some work to be done. We believe, I think, at the forum in the idea of reform done correctly. And so whether it's this bill or something in the future, we're going to be spending a lot of our time in public policy focusing on equity to try to find the best public policy solutions that will mean something for communities across the country. And we will continue to work with our partners both inside the sector and externally to make sure we are putting our best foot forward in this work. And so maybe this bill isn't the end all to be all, we shall see, but that doesn't stop us from continuing to do this work.
Well, we really look forward to seeing your recommendations. We hope that they're put out into the public arena. Jan, last word on a takeaway.
Oh, I don't know. This is like the beginning of the last words, right? Everybody's gonna have to say after this, they're all going to tell people on their organizations, did you hear what that person said? I think that this is a political issue, not just a policy issue, and just want to remind us about that. And a lot of times, policy issues get made by people who are very dependent on their very large campaign donors, and we just can't ignore that aspect of it. And so I think that hasn't been addressed here. I do think that this kind of forum is very helpful to have. And I thank IS for providing it to us. And we had our policy convention last week and also had a discussion on this, a debate actually, including a representative from a community foundation. So I think that these kinds of discussions where people hear more are really important. And I just want to say, we at Cal Nonprofits, we have a small staff of 6. We're not a giant, machine. But if people want to reach out to us directly, I'm going to put my email in the chat so that you can reach out to us.
Thank you so much, Jan. I want to make sure everyone knows that there's going to be it dropped into the chat, a survey that IS would love you to take. It's super short and you need to do it while you're still on this webinar. I want to thank Jan and Matthew for so much good advice and also contextualizing what we're dealing with here, and also to really be thinking about where we're going in the future, not just with this piece of legislation, but with philanthropic reform generally. Thank you to Independent Sector, to Jeffrey, to Allison, to Emily, to Ben, and everyone else that helps make the policy world come true here in Independent Sector and provides a good educational platform. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Cindy and Jan and Matthew. And thanks to everybody for joining us this afternoon.